My own personal Fiddler on the Roof moment would have to be playing Grandma Seidel in a summer camp production in the mid-1960s. And if you rack your brain, you probably have your own, whether tearing up over sunrise, sunset at a wedding or bar mitzvah, or seeing Topol play Tevye in the movie for the first time. Drama critic and Jewish historian Alisa Solomon will enlighten us on how Sholem Aleichem story of Tevye the Milkman became a cultural touchstone for people all over the world. She's here tonight with Wonder of Wonders, a cultural history of Fiddler on the Roof. Please welcome Alisa Solomon to the JCCSF.
Thank you, Barbara, and everyone here at the JCCSF. It's really a pleasure to be here and to, can I talk and do this at the same time? I'm not sure. It's very much a pleasure to be here and to be speaking tonight as the culminating event of the Fiddler at 50 celebration here in the Bay Area, which has been a great way to celebrate this show that seems to continue to reverberate, and I expect it will be continuing to do so for another half century at least. It's astonishing for me to realize that we now stand in relation to Fiddler on the Roof, that is to say 50 years away from its creation, the same temporal distance that the artists who made Fiddler on the Roof stood in relation to the Sholem Aleichem stories about Tevye that were written from over a 20-year period from 1894 to roughly 1915. That seems like so much longer ago than the 50 years between us and Fiddler because, of course, of the tremendous changes in Jewish American culture and the shift from Yiddish to English language popular culture. And I'll be talking a little bit about the 50 years since Fiddler and forward to us tonight, though, of course, the story of what happened before Fiddler, where it came from, the Sholem Aleichem stories, and then their translation into English and the representation and the construction of an idea of the shtetl in the post-war period is part of what I talk about in Wonder of Wonders. So exactly 50 years ago today, Jerry Bach, the composer, Sheldon Harnick, the lyricist, Joseph Stein, the librettist, and Jerry Robbins, the director and choreographer, were hard at work on hammering out the script to Fiddler on the Roof, to making it into the show that all of us know and presumably love. They were casting the show. They were in the middle of casting the show. Robbins took an extraordinarily long time to put the actors together for the production. He started casting it in the fall of 1963 and kept working on that right up until they started rehearsals in June of 1964. But by this point in January, Zero Mostel was already signed on to play Tevye. They started rehearsals in June. They worked for several weeks in New York City. Then they went on the road in tryouts, as used to happen with Broadway shows, to Detroit, and then to Washington, D.C. in August, and then they came back and opened on September 22nd, 1964 in New York City. And at that time, no one had the slightest inkling that they were making something that anyone would want to be talking about in this way half a century later. Even though by Washington, where the show was beginning to gel, the company felt, and the reviews were very strong, they did have a sense that it was going to be reasonably successful. You know, the actors I interviewed told me that they started to feel by Washington that maybe they'd have employment for maybe a year. But they had no idea that it would be a blockbuster success, and even less that Fiddler would become something much more than a musical. What more it became and how it became it is my subject today. I'd like to look at some of the ways that Fiddler on the Roof, a constructed piece of that very artificial form called the Broadway musical, turned into nothing less than folklore. Half a century after Sholem Aleichem created Tevye the Milkman, Tevye the dairyman, the character was embraced as a worldwide symbol of Jewish perseverance and adaptability. And the tragicomic patriarch has not lost any of his radiant, iconic power yet. So let's start by establishing the facts. The show's reach has been enormous for the last 5 decades. I think you'd break Google if you tried to find all the online references. There were about 5 million Google hits last time I searched Fiddler on the Roof. But way before there was any such thing as Google, Fiddler began stretching into homes across North America and across the globe and into popular culture like no other musical before it or after it. Fiddler reached its 900th New York performance in November 1966, 26 months after the premiere, without having had one empty seat or even an empty standing room spot. In fact, Norman Jewison, who directed the film version, we just saw the beginning of, or the end of the tradition song at the beginning of the film made in 1971. Norman Jewison wanted to see the show and didn't have a ticket. He came to New York and they gave him a cushion so he could sit in the aisle and see the show. That's how sold out it was. In this short time, the producer, Hal Prince, had returned a profit of 352% to investors, not including the contemplated film sale, which was already in the works by then. So as we might put it today, the show went viral. Back then, that meant national companies were lighting down in cities large and small all over the country, and foreign productions were opening all over the world. By 1971, there had been 15 productions in Finland alone. And the show had played in 32 countries. But one didn't need to be near a theater hosting a production to know and partake of the Fiddler phenomenon. In his Tevye costume, arms posed as if playing an invisible violin, Zero Mostel graced the October 19th cover of Newsweek in 1964, which had a paid circulation of 1.5 million at the time, which I like to say is maybe the most nostalgic point of this entire talk. The original cast album at that point, released the same month, topped $1 million in sales within a year. Right away, wedding bands all over the country, wedding bands all over the country were expected to be able to strike up the tunes on demand. Long before the movie played in cinemas in every small town, Cannonball Adderley recorded a jazz version of the score. That's what you're hearing a little bit of now. Joe Quijano recorded a Latin version. Edie Gourmet sang Matchmaker on The Ed Sullivan Show. And this was only a few months, it's significant to note, was just some months after the weekly television variety program caused a sensation by presenting 4 British fellows in tight suits and skinny ties called The Beatles. Popular culture was changing, and this was a moment of fascinating transition for a show that, after all, is about transition. A time when the emerging new youth musics still paid homage to Broadway as a longtime source of popular hits. And if you don't believe me, here's an example. The Supremes and the Temptations teamed up in 1968 to produce an album of Broadway favorites. And part of the album is a medley from Fiddler. The Temptations performed it on national TV in a special broadcast on NBC. And astoundingly, some video of that performance survives. It's very fuzzy video, but I think it's worth squinting through the haze to see a glimpse of the transfer from Jewish Midtown to African American Motown. So here's just a bit of it. Listen for some tweaks to the lyrics. I could be hung up for good, they sing, and if she were the grooviest girl in town. So here we go.
Matchmaker, matchmaker, look through your book and make me a perfect match. Matchmaker, I'll bring the wine, I'll bring the matchmaker and fine. Look through your book, I'm misunderstood, but I could be hung up for good.
So the Temptations. And they're, kind of slicked up for the occasion with those outfits and with the arrangement, but you still get the sense of the Motown there with that saxophone underneath and the little bit of, swiveling hips and so on. A few years later, the Osmond brothers, of all people, recorded these same arrangements, and I actually have a clip of that, and if anyone wants to see it later, I might be persuaded to show it if you have the stomach for it. But all of this is to say that Fiddler quickly belonged to everyone. But, of course, it had special resonance for Jews. And as we'll see, the show balanced as gracefully as its eponymous Fiddler on the point between universalism and particularism. In these days of Jon Stewart and Sarah Silverman, and as we'll see in a while, Chabad telethons with capering Hasidim, it's hard to put oneself in the mindset of a 1964 audience. They were not used to seeing Jews in popular culture, a certain kind of Jew. That is, because of course, Jews had been visible on the Broadway stage and elsewhere for a very long time. From the hugely popular intermarriage comedy, A.B. Irish Rose and its many imitators in the 1920s, The Diary of Anne Frank in 1955, the cheery Zionist musical Milk and Honey in 1961, and on television, the J-word on television, the J-word thrived, there they are, the Goldbergs, as early as 1949 when the Goldbergs crossed over from radio to become one of TV's first sitcoms. But the Y-word, for Yiddish, was something else. Images of Eastern European Jewry flourished exclusively in the Yiddish language theaters popular with the immigrant generation, and in the post-war era, in significant books and artworks that shaped America's image of Eastern European Jewish past, but were mostly consumed in private or Jewish venues. On the Great White Way, Jews had to be white, not greenhorns. And amid the dawning post-Holocaust consciousness, Fiddler was the first big public work to call forth the old country with affection, evoking the richness of a vanished world and asserting that its people found their continuance, or at least their vindication, in the dizzying success of the new generations of Jewish Americans. Fiddler came to stand for that history, and to this day it's taught as a document of shtetl life in schools at all levels. And thus it has come to stand for Jewishness itself. And here's some recent evidence. So first, the December greeting card for or from interfaith families, on which the fiddler has to share his rooftop with none other than that other mythic and perhaps much jollier figure, Santa Claus. And here, the fiddler shares his music too, the very tradition that, as the opening song tells us, defines Jewish life in Anatevka. And I'll have a little more to say about that keyword in a few moments. In Poland, as I learned during my research for Wonder of Wonders, Fiddler has had an especially fascinating role helping to unlock the subject of Jewish history there, and the show has served as a kind of stand-in for Poland's decimated Jewish culture. In this case, in restaurants in Warsaw, Łódź, and Krakow, restaurants called Anatevka, or using fiddler motifs in their decor. And sometimes the warm feeling associated with the show is enough of a sell, as in this Polish vodka, a potato vodka called Fiddler. It comes with a music box that plays If I Were a Rich Man in Polish. And now you have to be a rich man to afford this 40-proof luxury vodka, I think. And then just a few nights ago, thanks to my local cousin, and I laughed my head off at Beach Blanket Babylon here in San Francisco, and amid the hilariously elaborate headdresses and the ethnic camp, I appreciated this fiddler illusion in the show's evocation of Jews, where we see the reference to the bottle dance, which I'll have a little more to say about later as well. This guy with a Manischewitz on his head. Back in New York, one of my favorite appropriations of Fiddler and its iconic power blessed the activism of Occupy Wall Street. This, of course, is the logo of the Occupy movement at Zuccotti Park. And when some Jewish radicals decided to participate in the Occupy activities by holding a Yom Kippur Kol Nidre service outside, right across the street from Zuccotti Park. This is how they advertised it. So I think there's an ironic wink in the use of the fiddler atop the Wall Street Ball, but at the same time, a way of marking the event's Jewish bona fides. And one more of the many examples of Fiddler's ability to confer such authority.
And this is a very special Rosh Hashanah for the Jewish people because it's their last one. You see, Pat Robertson and his son Gordon are taking it back for Christians, as Gordon explained on the 700 Club.
Celebrate Rosh Hashanah. I encourage Christians everywhere to get in touch with the festivals within the Jewish calendar. I don't know why we left them in our church history, and it's time to reclaim them.
Exactly. It is also time for Christians to reclaim Fiddler on the Roof. Instead of Topol, the part of Tevye will be played by Mel Gibson. It's all really in the beard.
So this cracks me up every time, even though I know what's coming by now. Colbert's joke depends not only on the incongruity of a famed anti-Semite portraying an iconic Jew, but also on Colbert's drawing a parallel between the High Holy Days and a Broadway musical, between Christian calls to claim Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and a Christian appropriation of a Jewish paragon. How did we get here? How could a fictional character from a Broadway show, funny, complicated, affable as he may be, end up standing for Jewishness itself? How could a pop culture figure come to be as important and as sanctified as Yom Kippur? That I can answer in one word. Yes, tradition, and one word and maybe a few more of explanation. And in fact, I'm going to answer with 3 songs and a dance. But yes, the first of those songs, tradition.
Because of our traditions, everyone here knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Tuesday night, much better for a living, feel what you should be. Say different and resurrect and center in the house. That's my word at home. The Papa, tradition. The Papa, tradition. Pull myself away to make a prosper home.
So this clip is from a production at a junior high school in Brooklyn from 1968. An amazing production, very talented kids, as you can see. It was created during the height of a particularly ugly battle in New York City over the question of community control of the public schools, a battle that took the form of the city's Jews pitted against its African Americans. Very ugly. And in the middle of the conflagration, this production went up over the objections of some of the Jewish community. I tell the whole story of this production in Wonder of Wonders, and I really came to love these kids, many of whom I managed to find. I mean, kids, they're in their late 50s now, but and the now late director of the production, Richard Pirro, was a teacher in Brooklyn those years and was really so devastated by the experience of the attacks on it that he left teaching in New York and he actually moved out here. And though he died last year, I was lucky to get to meet him and spend many hours talking about this work with him at a meeting here in San Francisco. But yes, the key to the show's structure, and in ways that the director Jerry Robbins and his creative team never could have guessed to its abiding power, was the idea of tradition as the way of defining Tevye's life. How this idea came to be is a famous story that the authors love to tell. They were having script meetings with Robbins once he came into the process. Bach, Harnick, and Stein had already come up with the idea to work on the show. They drafted it, and it took a while before they got Jerry Robbins to be the director. But they kept having meetings, and Robbins had a lot of ideas for the script, and he kept asking a question that struck the authors as unnecessary for having such an obvious answer. What is this show about? He'd lean back in his chair, he'd await their answer, but the authors were dumbfounded. Robbins knew full well that the show traced the trials of Tevye, a simple Jew trying to scratch out a living. They had nothing new to tell him. Still, Robbins kept hammering the question. Harnack likes to say he hammered it like a district attorney. And every time, one of the creators gave the same answer. The show's about a dairyman and his marriageable daughters. No, 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 Robbins would growl. That's not it. No one remembers who uttered the words that finally provided the answer to Robbins's persistent question, but they seem to rearrange the molecules in the room. It's about the dissolution of a way of life. Robbins leaned forward. That's it, he said, that's it. He wasn't the sort to cry out or slap the table, but his enthusiasm was unmistakable. It's tradition, he asserted. Yes, that's it. We have to establish the tradition at the beginning, and then the audience will see how those traditions are breaking down. That's the show. Instantly, Robbins saw how this theme could give him a pliant and powerful dramatic tension around which to stage the action. They'd established the tradition in the opening number, and by introducing the communities, and also by defining each familial role, and by using what Robbins called the oldest folk form, the circle. The forces breaking down the traditions would press from both inside and outside. In the first instance, modern children challenging their parents' staid ways. The generational conflict would make the story universal. At the same time, the violent anti-Semitism of Tsarist Russia would exert pressure externally. The persecution endured by Tevye and the people of Anatevka was on account of their Jewishness, expressed by the very traditions that were in danger of unraveling. At the play's end, Robbins would make the circle uncurl, break apart and open, as Tevye and his family walk it round one last time as they set out for their journey to New York. Through his own personal pursuit for a reconnection to his heritage, and this was a long and torturous path that I was fascinated to trace in the couple of years I spent reading Jerry Robbins's letters and diary notes, Robbins intuited that the story could also be embraced by Jewish audiences in search of a usable past, as their own ties to tradition attenuated. And as they themselves tried to find the balance between, on the one hand, the exuberance of post-war American prosperity and a social and professional access that they had never before enjoyed, and on the other hand, the devastation of Jewish obliteration in Europe. So let me show you what I mean about this balance. So it's obvious what we see here. It appears unmistakably to be an Ashkenazi Jewish wedding. The clothing, the chuppah, the braided candles, the separation of men and women, the kiddush, as we'll see in a moment, the ring placed on the index finger. As I'm sure you recognize, this is the wedding sequence from the Norman Jewison 1971 movie version of Fiddler. This scene of a marriage between Seidel and the tailor model comes right in the middle of the 3-hour movie, and it's a whopping 21 minutes long, this scene. This is long by any standards, but especially when you consider that in the original Sholem Aleichem story that it's based on, the wedding is a throwaway line. Auf morgen is given bei uns das Knasmo, and takabod nach dem de Chasana. The next day we celebrated the engagement, and soon after, the wedding. That's it. The chuppah is at the center of the wedding sequence that it is at the center of Fiddler, and central not only in its placement, but also in the way that it accomplishes, in such beautifully simple terms, the musical's primary project, to meld a fond vision of the old country with a modern American sensibility. Through the magic of cinema or of theatrical irony, there's a big difference between what we see and what we hear.
Sunrise, sunset, swiftly flow the days. Ceilings turn overnight, the sun flies, blossoming even as we gaze. Sunrise, sunset,
Visually, the action goes according to the laws of Moses and Israel, to quote the Jewish wedding text. Orally, according to the heartstring tugs of Tin Pan Alley and Bride magazine. Unlike the ceremony, the song is ethnically generic. Fittingly, it is a waltz for a wedding. It suffuses the wedding ceremony with the sentimental longing of parents for children who grow up too fast, like sunflowers blossoming even as we gaze, a feeling that parallels or even is an opportunity to project the larger nostalgia Fiddler evokes for the lost world of an idealized shtetl. In the scene, the wedding ceremony is transformed from a matter of law into a charming set of customs, just as in the opening song from Torah, the teaching and that contains all the law, to tradition. And tradition is something every modern culture can relate to, especially perhaps mid-20th century American Jews. Joe Stein loved to tell the story of the show's premiere in Tokyo. A producer asked him how Americans could understand Fiddler since, he said, it's so Japanese. In a number of ways, the musical adjusts the original Tevye stories to speak to its own place and moment, as many artists before had done with Sholem Aleichem. Stein moved Tevye from the countryside to Anatevka, turning the hero from a country Jew into the archetypal man of the shtetl, and thereby contributing to a simplified idea of Eastern European Jewish history that created a unified mythic Jewish past. In a definitive essay on the changes from the Sholem Aleichem stories to the musical, Seth Wolitz has argued that in Fiddler, American ideals of individual rights, progress, and freedom of association are assimilated into the Judaic tradition, and Tevye's values are posited as the same as America's, only thwarted by pogroms and oppression. The musical Tevye becomes a Jewish pilgrim, a victim of religious persecution, fleeing intolerant Europe to the land of fulfillment, America. Thus, in perhaps Fiddler's most chutzpahdik embrace of Jewish dialectics, the musical can end on the tragic note of dispossession and still feel hopeful. That's one big reason the show was embraced passionately by American Jews, responding to its affirmation of American values and for positing that one could trace a straight line from Jewish values right to the American ones. This was a thrilling development on Broadway, a form largely invented by Jewish Americans, but one in which such an assertive claim had yet to be made. And this brings us to song number 3. We have Tradition, Sunrise, Sunset, and now a song many of you may not know as well as those other two. Here's Sheldon Harnick singing it for a live audience.
When Messiah comes, he will say to us, I apologize that I took so long. But I had a little trouble finding you, over here a few and over there a few. You were hard to reunite, but everything is going to be all right. Up in heaven there, how I wrung my hands when they exiled you from the promised land. Into Babylon you went like castaways on the first of many, many moving days. What a day and what a blow. How terrible I felt you'll never know. Since that day, many men said to us, get thee out. Kings they were, gone they are, we're still here. When Messiah comes, he will say to us, don't you think I know what a time you've had? Now I'm here, you'll see how quickly things improve. You won't have to move unless you want to move. You shall never more take flight. Yes, everything is going to be all right. When Messiah comes, he will say to us, I was worried sick if you'd last or not. And I spoke to God and said, would that be fair if Messiah came and there was no one there? And the Lord replied to me, wait, everything will be all right, you'll see. Many times, many men took our homes, took our lives. Kings they were, gone they are, we're still here. When Messiah comes and his reign begins, truth and justice then shall appear on earth. But if this reward we would be worthy of, we must keep our covenant with God above. So be patient and devout, and gather up your things and get thee out.
So this to me sounds more like a song that Tony Kushner might have written in, this year than a song from 1964 for Fiddler on the Roof. It's witty and ironic, a little edgy. There's pathos in the humor, even some anger and defiance. Most unnerving, perhaps, is that in the form of a chirpy and comic tune, it makes oblique reference for a post-war audience to the Holocaust. Would that be fair if Messiah came and there was no one there? And that, I think, is part of the reason that this song had to go. This song was in the show. It came at the point in the last scene of Fiddler when the people of Anatevka have been told they must clear out. And someone says, "Rabbi, wouldn't this be a good time for the Messiah to come?" And if you know the show, you know his answer. "I guess we'll just have to wait for him somewhere else. Let's start packing." But in on-the-road tryouts in Detroit, and even for about a week in Washington before the New York opening, the answer came by way of this song. But it wasn't going over so well with audiences. The rabbi sang it, and it wasn't working, so they took it away from the rabbi. They gave it to Tevye, Zero Mustel, and it still wasn't working. As Sheldon Harnick puts it, the song made the audience uncomfortable. And so the team, constantly looking for ways to shorten the evening, decided to cut the song, even though it was Zero Mustel's favorite. And he made sure to tell everyone with salty Yiddish epithets that they were nuts not to keep it in. Zero's curses notwithstanding, out it went. What was it that made people so uncomfortable? What tone and image was Fiddler on the Roof presenting that could not accommodate that wry and discomforting musical number? The ironic allusion to the Holocaust, as I've mentioned, I think is one reason. The shock and loss of this cataclysmic catastrophe, not yet even named the Holocaust, was still too raw and traumatizing to lend itself even to the indirect and sympathetic kind of humor in the lyrics. More significant, singling out the experience of Jews in the Holocaust in 1964 was, for the team creating the musical at least, regarded as going against the American grain, into which Jews were rapidly assimilating. Jews in the 1950s and early 60s were not defining themselves as the victims of Hitler, but were seeking integration into American society and culture by embracing a liberal family of man ethos and claiming an equal place within it. When Messiah comes, works against that effort. For the focus to stay on the redemption offered by America, both for the audiences of the 1960s and those today who respond nostalgically or for the first time to the show's universalizing impulses, the degradations of Europe must be figured as part of the world that is left behind, escaped, not recalled as the graveyard it became. In the song, the Messiah's tuneful apologies clash with Fiddler's forward-looking way of looking back. At the same time, the deleted song also threatened to make the play what some producers the authors originally approached for backing accused it of being, as they turned down Bach, Harnick, and Stein. That is, of being, as they put it, too Jewish. Too Jewish, why? Because the song highlights the central doctrinal difference between Christians and Jews, namely that, well, we don't think the Messiah's gotten here just yet. Fiddler reflected a Jewish desire to blend in as a distinct but well-fitting member of the American mosaic. The song tipped the balance too far in the direction of Jewish difference. The sweet spot with the tradition concept was in handing over a legacy that could be fondly claimed without exacting any demands. Heritage, after all, is not something one does. It is something one has. Through Fiddler, Robbins and millions of spectators in the decades to come could cherish and admire a legacy in the safely secular make-believe space of a theater. It could be honored, appreciated, celebrated, and relegated to the past, a proud reminder of how far we'd come. And that made Tevye the folk hero of Jewish America, the authority on our history and legacy to be quoted by rabbis, as the rabbi did at my own nephew's wedding last spring, and in other ways as well. One of the most beloved Tevyas over the years, Theodore Bickel, who has performed the role a couple of thousand times, demonstrates how much ritual authority Tevye has come to command in this advertisement for a funeral home, assuring potential customers that the company heeds the traditions. It's not so easy to read this, but I can tell you that what the text says here is I've played many roles in my career. Perhaps the most important is Tevye, and because I've performed it so many times, I understand the importance of keeping traditions and keeping our faith alive. And so, therefore, I can vouch for this funeral company and tell you that they, he can give it its hechsher from the fictional character of Tevye. Yeah, exactly. I hope so. And Bickel invokes the immense moral authority Tevye commands, not only for commercial pop propaganda, but also for political propaganda, as in this very recent video.
My name is Theodore Bickel, and I want to ask you to help prevent a terrible moral tragedy. I spent much of my life playing Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. I see a parallel with what is happening today. 40,000 Bedouins in the Negev desert are being told to get out of their homes. Remember the scene in Fiddler on the Roof when the Russians arrive and tell them they have 3 days to get out. Tevye says, "Why should I get out?" They say, "Not just you, all of you." He says, "Why? Why should we leave?" "I don't know why. I have an order here." He said, "Piece of paper and get thee out. What if we refuse to leave?" We know the consequences of refusal.
So there's one last and very instructive arena of Fiddler's abiding power left to explore, and this brings us to the dance I mentioned, and it brings us into the ritual realm. This dance was a very late addition to the show, joining the action in Washington after the reviews there had been published. No one knew it was coming, except, of course, for Jerry Robbins. Though Robbins was estranged from his Jewishness as a young man, the name change from Rabinowitz just being the surface manifestation, he had warm memories of a trip at the age of 6 to his father's childhood home, the shtetl of Rozhanka, in what was then, between the wars, part of Poland. And when he read and heard the early draft of Fiddler, he was charmed by the material and excited by the possibility of delving into a culture whose rejection he was beginning to regret. He immediately amassed a small library of books and films and began cramming like a grad student with oral exams coming up. And he hired a dance research consultant, a woman named Devorah Lapson, an expert in Jewish dance, to broker his entree into Orthodox celebrations, into fieldwork, really, ethnographic fieldwork. Robbins reached her in the fall of 1963 through the Jewish Education Committee, where she was promoting the innovative idea of integrating dance into children's school curriculum. Robbins's timing couldn't have been better. The autumn festival of Simchas Torah was coming up, and Lapson knew of a shtibel, or a small community prayer house, where this typically ecstatic holiday would be celebrated with special abandon. Robbins attended, bringing along Joe Stein, Jerry Bach, and Sheldon Harnick. Dozens of men crammed into the tiny shtibel, singing, clapping, knocking back schnapps after schnapps after schnapps. Their dancing came as a revelation. The secular showmen expected gentle folk forms, everybody holding hands, moseying around a circle. Instead, they felt the room shake, from the floor stomping, body twisting, athletic flinging, and writhing. Then, Lapson scored an invitation for a Hasidic wedding. Once again, the dancing enthralled Robbins with what he came to call its virile ferocity, and he couldn't get enough of it. He attended wedding after wedding, where he saw the bride and groom lifted up in chairs by their guests, and often a flimsy cord hastily stretched between stanchions instantly acquire the force of a high concrete barrier separating men from women. But every time it was the men's dancing that amazed Robbins. In handwritten notes, he marveled. "My great wonder, watching the dancers, was how people weren't hurt and bruised as bodies were flung centrifugally from out-of-control circles. Hats flew off, chairs overturned. But the rough, dominant force that was released by all this kinetic energy was overpowering. Two things held them together: Their constant hand grip, when if broken by the external momentum of the dance or by another body flinging itself into the dancer, was always regained, reunited. And secondly, the deep and powerful assertion, a strength I never knew, a dedication to a right, claiming survival and joy, procreation and celebration, an explosive foot thrust to the floor that shook the room, that said, yes, I am here and I celebrate the continuity of my existence. This was a profound reaction for a man who had long felt shame about what he regarded as weak Jewish masculinity. Now, that stereotype was pulverized by the whirling frenzy of these dancers. From the beginning of his work on the show, Robbins insisted that it emphasized Jewish robustness and resilience, not cutesy sentimentality. The dancing he saw at the weddings provided the proof positive and further inspiration for that demand. Something else intrigued him too. A man with a rusty beard who seemed to be a regular at these weddings, entertaining the guests by weaving among them with a particular trick. Devorah Lapson had seen such antics during her research in Europe and told Robbins that he was performing a Flaschentanz, a caper in which the man balances a bottle on his head as he dances, perhaps to prove himself sober. Robbins referred to him as Mr. Redbeard, but it didn't take long for Lapson to identify him and track him down. And more, this Rabbi Ackerman from Borough Park would have been glad to meet with Robbins. Doesn't seem that the meeting ever happened, but the image lodged itself in Robbins' imagination. And it simmered there, eventually to be transformed by his artistry, high emotion, personal mishigas about being a Jew and a gay man, and by his theatrical showmanship. It's impossible to know exactly and minutely what moves Robbins took from Mr. Redbeard's frolics or from the communal cavorting among the men at Orthodox weddings, but there's no doubt that Robbins embellished on what he observed. A dozen years earlier, when choreographing Small House of Uncle Thomas, the play within the play of The King and I, Robbins hit a dead end, trying to create authentic Siamese dance, despite his extensive research into the genre. Only when Richard Rogers urged him to take some license with the movement vocabulary was he able to break through his inhibition and devise an exciting 14-minute dance drama that conveyed the idea of Thai, of Siamese-ness, with its cocked legs, flexed feet and wrists, and wide stance demi-pliés. But it actually borrowed from Balinese Lagong dance, Peking opera, Japanese kabuki, as well as Martha Graham, and of course, most important, from Robbins's own imagination. Excited as he had been by the dancing he'd seen at the weddings, Robbins showed no signs of using that research in the show. He didn't mention it in production meetings. He didn't bring it up in rehearsals in New York or Detroit or in the early days in Washington. Then, one morning, about a week into the Washington run, after local reviewers had declared Fiddler on the Roof a triumph, Robbins called a rehearsal of the male dance corps at 10 o'clock in the theater lobby, the carpeted theater lobby. The men had no idea why he wanted them there. Many who didn't have demanding parts in the L'chaim number had long figured that nothing taxing was being asked of them, and they had stopped keeping up a daily workout routine. Robbins didn't say much by way of explanation when the dozen men assembled. He showed the troupe some steps, walking with a circle with some bounce in the knees to begin, and then, well, let's just say I think you can guess why the rehearsal was held in the carpeted lobby. Robbins knew that some bottles would be falling to the floor. He taught the troupe the moves in a few hours' time. He called a put-in rehearsal for later that afternoon, the entire cast playing through the wedding scene, and they burst into applause and some into tears when they saw the new number for the first time. That very night it went into the show, and it's brought the house down ever since. So you know I'm talking about this bottle dance, and here it is in the film. This shows us Robbins' choreographic genius radiantly on display. 2.5 riveting minutes of innovative movement that reveal situation and character, feed the action, and its very form encapsulate the show's ideals of Jewish revivification and cultural adaptation. Legendarily, the set designer Boris Aronson, who'd been driven up the wall by the way Robbins constantly changed his mind about the scenery, watched from the back of the house the first night the bottle dance went into the show, and at the close of the dance, he turned to Robbins' assistant, Richard Altman, and said, "Any man who can do that, I forgive everything." As in the movement for The King and I, In the bottle dance, Robbins similarly captured the spirit of the original by maintaining some essential elements. The balanced bottle, as we'll see, the arms pumping heavenward, the group in a frenzy at the end. And he built upon them with sheer choreographic ingenuity and showbiz panache. So you see, he's quadrupled the number of the dancers to begin with. And you hear how show busy it is. The music, cues us now that here comes the big moment. The appeal of this wild masculine vigor to a man who had been ashamed of his Jewishness, not to mention his gayness, is obvious enough. But his de-sissifying of the Jewish male through this dance also spoke to Jewish audiences who carried shame about the Holocaust, and especially of the accusation that Jews had gone like sheep to the slaughter. Robbins had two directorial notes for the dancers. "You're working yourself into a state of joy," he told them, and he said, "Butch it up." In its very form, the bottle dance embodies Fiddler's essential gesture by expressing what looks like a religious folk form within the idiom of a Broadway showstopper. So here, the camera just cuts away before you see the choreography's final pose, the quintessential foot-like finish. They all finish the dance like this, which you don't see in the film. Down on one knee, arms spread wide, chest thrust forward, kind of like Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer, that other Rabinowitz who went into show business and changed his name to Robin. You couldn't be any more razzmatazz than that. And this could be the end of the story insofar as the last rehearsals in Washington reshaped the show for better and forever. But something so much larger happened with the bottle dance, and it's an emblem of Fiddler's own function of providing a usable ethnic past to Americans in the 21st century. Through Robbins' genius, popular culture, as often happens, absorbs and remakes an element of the presumed folk culture, and then, amazingly, returns it to the folk who take it up as their own authentic expression. The choreography Robbins made up becomes, as you'll hear called in a moment, an age-old, magnificent dance, and a means of bringing Jewish tradition into a bar mitzvah as if the bar mitzvah itself were not sufficient to the purpose. So I'm going to show you two short clips to finish, and this is an advertisement for a group called the Amazing Bottle Dancers that you can hire.
Congratulations, you're planning a simcha, a wedding, a bar, a bat mitzvah, a 50th wedding anniversary. Now that's cause for a celebration. Obviously, you would love for your party to be something wonderful, something special and unique, not the same old, same old. Every one of the appearances of the Amazing Bottle Dancers is indeed something wonderful and truly unique. What you're about to see will be that special something, the highlight that you and your guests will always remember.
Shmuel, Nachum, Evram, Moshe, if you have Maddie, bring her in!
Pay attention to the music, which is the fiddler score.
But wait, there's more. The rabbis go out into the audience, getting everyone up for a horror that no one will soon forget, featuring authentic klezmer music. So whether it's a birthday, anniversary, temple banquet or installation, Hanukkah party at your home, a black tie wedding or one in the backyard, a bar or bat mitzvah, the Amazing Bottle Dancers is special for everyone, kids and adults. Hey, you don't even have to be Jewish to appreciate the humor, the tradition of this age-old, magnificent dance. And speaking of tradition, no matter how contemporary your simcha is, a little tradition never hurt.
So the tradition for the bar mitzvah comes from Broadway. If assimilation was a throwing off of visible and audible signs of Jewishness, this troupe, the Amazing Bottle Dancers, which is the brainchild of a Hollywood actor named Michael Pasternak, signals a level of acculturation that is so comfortable, so assured, that these clothes and accents can be donned and celebrated within our sophisticated, postmodern midst, but returning this time, as the repressed often does, as a joke. The transubstantiation of this image into and then out of Fiddler on the Roof took place alongside and unwittingly supported another effort to establish the bearded man in a cloak and broad hat as the iconic Jewish image, namely the rooting of Hasidic communities in post-war America and a self-conscious effort on their part to stake a claim as the standard of legitimate Judaism. As the scholar Samuel Heilman has written, Hasidim who came to America and rebuilt their bases here after the Holocaust are not, as he puts it, picturesque reminders of yesteryear, Jewish grandfathers and grandmothers caught in a bubble of time. Rather, these sects that once had represented a radical challenge to rabbinic Judaism now assert themselves as the most conservative elements in Jewish life. Quite deliberately, Heilman says, they sought to make themselves the image of the quintessential Jew. Heilman writes, they want the ear-locked, bearded Jew to be the image of the authentic Jew and his voice to be the only voice of Jewish authority. They see themselves as the defenders of the faith. And they go about asserting this claim through sophisticated community organizing, political backroom dealing, and multimedia extravaganza, which is why the last laugh belongs to them, specifically to the high-tech Lubavitchers who invited members of the Amazing Bottle Dancers to perform in their 28th annual Chabad telethon in 2008 in this special number with the actor Larry David.
A fiddler on a tote board. Sounds crazy, no? But here at Chabad, you might say every one of us is a fiddler on a tote board, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without losing his hat. We work day and night, helping people in need, with community centers, schools, and social programs. Now, it isn't easy. You may ask, why do we stay up there if it's so difficult? We stay because the Chabad house is our home. And how do we keep our balance? Well, that I can tell you in one word. Telethon!
And here come the Amazing Bottle Dancers. The Lubavitch Hasidim producing the telethon, and this one raised $8 million, by the way, are not only so secure in their identity and practice that they can enjoy the joke of the Amazing Bottle Dancers, they are profoundly savvy about how images work in popular culture. And so, for popular television viewers, they can use fake Hasidim and a Broadway musical to authenticate themselves for a mainstream audience. The Robbins choreography, the song tradition, the movie star Tevye all help to remove the aura of strangeness around the Hasidim and to move them into a familiar, fiddler-created comfort zone. This is the opposite of Brecht's Verfremdens effect. It's a naturalizing effect. It embraces Hasidim into American consciousness, where their lives can be not as shaky, but as stable as a fiddler on the roof. This is a process that began nearly half a century ago and shows no signs of slowing down yet. Thank you.
So now we'll open it up to questions. Please just raise your hand and I'll come to you with the mic.
Hi, a couple of quick questions. One, in all your research, who gave you the best stories about the putting together of the show? And then the second question is, in all your research, did you come across any criticism of the show by Jewish scholars or so on, that it was too slick or commercial or sentimental?
Yes to the second one, and I'll say more about that in detail. Everyone I was lucky to speak to was wonderful. I spent a lot of time with Sheldon Harnick, the lyricist, who's been incredibly generous with his time, and I was very lucky to spend the better part of a day with Joe Stein and to correspond with Jerry Bach before they both died in 2010. And then with a number of the original cast members. Austin Pendleton remembers everything in great detail. He was the original model, and he was just incredible. And I spoke to a number of the other cast members, chorus members, as well as some of the principals that are still alive. And tried to piece together the making of the show through the mosaic of their memories, which luckily did not contradict each other very much. I mean, it's tricky. I can't remember what happened 2 hours ago, and I was asking people to give me detailed descriptions of things that happened 50 years ago. But I also had notes, voluminous notes from Robbins and variant scripts and notes from the other creators and so on. So, but everybody was very warm and generous, and I think part of it is just that's because who they are, but also because of the show itself. People who worked on the show loved it very much and felt that they had really created a community of Anatevka. As for the other question about Yiddishists and Jewish scholars and their reaction to the show, not universally, but certainly vociferously, there were opponents. Irving Howe, who later wrote World of Our Fathers and arguably was able to find an audience for that because of Fiddler, wrote a scathing review in commentary where he referred to the show as representing the cutest shtetl we never had. And others, like the contemporary Yiddish literary scholar Ruth Weiss, in her relatively recent book, The Modern Jewish Canon, the introduction to that, has some scathing words for Fiddler on the Roof as well. And the basic argument, there's two basic arguments there. And Irving Howe's case, he was kind of reviewing the audience more than reviewing the show. He was angry that American Jews didn't know more about their history and that they were embracing Fiddler as a representation when all it was a Broadway show. But of course, all it was a Broadway show. It was not making other claims for itself. And the other criticism from him and especially from literary scholars is that it isn't the stories by Sholem Aleichem. It changes the stories. And it uses, for example, only 3 of the stories of the daughters. There are several more, much darker ones. A daughter who drowns herself, a daughter who marries the man that her father thinks she should marry and is absolutely miserable, and that man turns on Tevye and tells him that he should get lost and so forth. And they're just layers of irony, and the way the comedy works in the stories is very different from how a Broadway musical works. And they felt that it was an oversimplification. And to me, the only thing you can say in response to that is, yes, that's correct. This is a Broadway musical, and those are very intricate masterpieces of the short story form by Sholem Aleichem. They are not the same thing. But at the same time, Fiddler made Sholem Aleichem popular for many people who weren't familiar with him already. When Bach, Harnick, and Stein got started on working on the show, they had the idea to work on these stories. Joe Stein had remembered them from his childhood. They had read, somebody had recommended a Sholem Aleichem novel, Wandering Stars. It was a great novel about a 2 Yiddish theater troupes traveling the world. And they realized they couldn't make a musical out of it. It was too sprawling, had too many characters. And Stein said that he remembered, though, other Sholem Aleichem material, the Tevye stories from his childhood. And when they went looking for them, they had a hard time finding them. They'd been published in English in the 40s, but they were out of print. And after Fiddler's success, the stories came back into print, and new translations were made. And so people became interested, and people who wanted to find the Sholem Aleichem stories had a lot more access to them, if they weren't Yiddish readers, because of Fiddler. So I don't share that same scolding attitude, though I take the point.
Any other questions? Right up here.
What do you think resonates the most with Gentile audiences with Fiddler? And because there's the heartache and the persecution that you just can't escape, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's a lot of things. I mean, I think anybody can relate to the generational conflict and to the loss of home and the disintegration of tradition and to the splitting apart of families. I mean, those are all very universal themes. And, like the Japanese story, or, Sheldon tells a story about an Irish friend coming up to him, afterwards and saying, this was about my family. There are just tons and tons of reactions like that. So I don't think I can single out any particular thing. But, as I tried to show in the wedding scene, I think that the show generally operates on those 2 tracks all the way through, the very particular and the universal. And, if you're Jewish, you recognize all of these customs and rituals and so forth as something familiar and that, belongs to us. But if you're not, it's no impediment, to the engagement with those characters and the emotional involvement in what unfolds.
Yes, you spoke of the Japanese and the Polish versions. I wonder if either in the Russian version or some other one that might be very unexpected for us, like Finnish, I have no idea what that would be. If there's anything you want to highlight that was quite unexpected in translation.
There was a production in East Germany, in East Berlin at the Komischoper in the 60s. And the authorities required that all references to Russian oppression had to be taken out. So that's probably the most surprising aspect, I think, of a foreign production early on that I can remember off the top of my head. I think there's some questions up here, Andy.
Oh, the translation of the Jewish community prior to the war and to the Jewish community here would be a very difficult thing to translate. And I'm wondering whether the Fiddler on the Roof made it possible or made the translation easier and certainly quicker. And my next question is the relationship or the effect that the Fiddler on the Roof had on the Jewish community here, and apparently some effect it had on the non-Jewish community everywhere. How do you explain that?
Well, to the first question, I just agree with you. Yes, say that's right. How do I explain that? I mean, I tried to explain some of it in what I was just saying about that moment in 1964 when the show opened was, I guess a moment when Americans were ready to engage this. It was a kind of the high point of 20th century American liberalism, the ideal of tolerance, I think it was in some ways catching the wave of the civil rights movement. All of these kinds of ideas and feelings are underneath the values of this show. And there was, people were open and receptive to those ideas in that moment.
Our next question here in the back.
Hi, I haven't read your book yet, so I don't know to what extent you get into this, but you were discussing the cut Sheldon Harnick song, which was very biting, which I love, but was biting. And I'm wondering if some of the reason was they were nervous about hiring Zero Mostel, or could you speak a little to whether or not?
Well, they did hire Zero Mostel.
Right. So
yeah.
whether they were a little bit worried about getting some political flack or making it more
With that song?
political. Or no, just generally, if you could speak to some of the issues around him.
Yeah. So the question is, was there anxiety around the politics of the show, especially since Zero Mostel was in it? So that refers to Mostel having been blacklisted, and Robbins named names before the House On-American Activities Committee. So I think the first thing to say about that is these two men did not exactly love each other. Mostel really hated Robbins and really was disgusted by his having named names. And, Robbins, later in his life, was disgusted with himself for having done so as well. It's all over his diaries and notes. And that rivalry played out in the rehearsal room. And which was a rivalry that wasn't only political, it was also a clash of personalities. I don't think you could have two more different temperaments than very classical and erect and contained Jerome Robbins and sloppy, spilling, obstreperous Zero Mostel, who gave Robbins a hard time every step of the way. No, the blacklist was over by then. Joe Stein had been a communist in his youth. Everybody was a liberal, at least, working on the show. And I think they all understood that Mostel was far and away the best man for the part. And nothing in any of their notes, nor anything any of them said to me, suggested that they had any anxiety about like a red taint to the show at all. Though there is a kind of back history about some of the Sholem Aleichem material that I talk about in Wonder of Wonders, which was a couple of adaptations in the 50s by a troupe led by Arnold Pearl and Howard Silva, a blacklisted radio and TV writer, and Howard Silva, the actor, who originated the role of Judd in Oklahoma and did a lot of film roles. Both of them were blacklisted and were very active on the left, and they formed a theater company as a way to put themselves back to work with a whole bunch of their blacklisted friends. And what did they do? A play called The World of Sholem Aleichem, and then later an adaptation of the Tevye stories called Tevye and His Daughters, not musicals, but in the 1950s, the first English language stage versions to make a big splash of the Sholem Aleichem material. So there is a deep attachment of this material to strains of the left. And in fact, the first translations into English by Francis and Julius Butwin in the 40s came about because they were leftist activists with Yiddish backgrounds, and there was a kind of vogue for finding the literature of the folk, the proletariat. And for them, that meant the Yiddish folk. And so they translated Sholem Aleichem.
Our next question, and yes, this is our last question.
I went to see Topol in a Castro Theater 2 months ago, and he talked about the show was in Israel in the 60s, the Bombatzur. I don't know if you know the show.
Yeah, I have a chapter about the Israel production.
And he said that it was in Yiddish, was not popular.
Yeah.
If you have any information about the show, and if you know any other show in anywhere else in Yiddish, was ever play.
Yeah. So the first foreign production was in Israel, and as I said, I have a chapter in Wonder of Wonders that sort of chronicles how that came about and how it went over. And it was produced by a guy named Godek, who was he was called the Israeli Merrick. Giora Godek, exactly, who was bringing splashy American-style musicals to Israel. Had a big hit with My Fair Lady, and then brought Fiddler. And as this gentleman mentioned, the first man who played Tevye was a sort of roly-poly comedian named Bomba Tsur, and then was replaced by Shmuel Rudensky, an actor of more gravitas. And it's not clear if that's who they wanted at first. He had a contract with Habima that they had to get him out of, and so on. But anyway, Rudensky then played the role. And though the critics disparaged it, it was a big popular hit in Israel. And then Godek had the idea that because Rudensky was a native Yiddish speaker, was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, that maybe they should do the show in Yiddish translation, which they did. And it was a critical success, but it was a flop. Audiences just didn't, I think it ran for about 2 weeks. Godek had the idea that maybe they could tour it in parts of Europe or Argentina. That never happened. Now that's partially because it was a flop. It's also partially because Godek lost his fortune and couldn't get the money together to do it at that point. And there's a whole sort of tragic story about him. But as far as I know, there's been no major production of it in Yiddish since then, though the translation back into Yiddish is very interesting, has interesting aspects to it that bring it in some ways closer to the Sholem Aleichem material, filtered through the artistry of showbiz men.
Well, thank you so much for such an informative evening, and everyone please join us out in the lobby. Alisa will be signing her book. Thank you so much.